Hi guys, today our topic is how to play with hanging pawns. So, here we have the structure of hanging pawns, and I'd like to talk a little bit about the advantages of hanging pawns. Of course, the pawns has its advantages and disadvantages, but for the disadvantages of hanging pawns, you can see the video how to play against hanging pawns. Now let's talk about the advantages. We see that the pawns control many squares, b5, c5, d5 and e5, which gives opportunity to create an attack. General ideas in hanging pawns is to advance the pawn either d5, after which there is a crashing attack, either with c5, to control other squares like d6 and put a big pressure on b7 pawn. Also, hanging pawns gives advantage to the rooks just because the b file is open, and sometimes the rooks transfer to third rank to attack the king side. And of course, the advantages of hanging pawns is that it creates a great outpost for knights. For example, after c5, d6 square is great outpost for knight. But for the exact examples, let's see the games. So, here we have a great game, the very classical game, Bernstein-Capablanca. By the way, there is a must-see series about Capablanca covered by world champion Rustam Kasimdzhanov, but he did not cover this game, and I'm really happy to show you this game, but I really recommend you to find the series of Capablanca covered by Rustam Kasimdzhanov elsewhere on Chess24. So let's start with d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, knight f6, knight f3, bishop e7. We will quickly go through the opening phase, because what we need to see in this game is how Capablanca played with hanging pawns. Castle, e3, knight bd7, rook c1, b6, c d5, e d5, queen a4, bishop b7, bishop a6. So after bishop a6, queen a6, c5. Capablanca plays c5, offering opponent to transfer the position into hanging pawns. That's what happened. Bishop f6, knight f6, dc5, bc5, and here we have hanging pawns. A very typical example, so I really want you to pay attention on this position. Castle, and from here, Capablanca plays extremely well. Well, I mean, of course, opening he played very good, but this particular moves and ideas he made in this game is just brilliant. He himself enjoyed this game very much. So he played here queen b6, offering the exchange. Of course, queen b6, a b6 is in black's favor because there are no more weak hanging pawns, and the a file is open for the rook, and in case of a3, just normal rook fd8 with great play. Queen b6, queen e2. And here, it is a very important moment. The move that Capablanca played has a brilliant idea. c4. Of course, it could be rook fd8 or rook ac8 normal moves, but c4 has a very good idea, putting pressure on b2 pawn. It might be a little strange for you to see this move c4 just because black gives up the control of d4 square, and right now white can control and block the d5 pawn and c4 pawn very easily. But what is a great advantage of this pawn on c4 is that it very much disturbs the advance of the b pawn. And also there might be a really good post on d3 for the knight. But okay, this is another topic from this game, so let's see how it continued. Rook fd1, rook fd8, and knight d4. We have here a very logical continuation of the game. White blocked the d5 and c4 pawn, and then tries to push the d5 pawn either with rook c2, rook d2, or rook d2, rook d1 to double the rooks on d file. But of course, Capablanca foreseen that he should not allow this, and he has a good counter chances to attack the b2 pawn. Bishop b4. A very useful move, because at some point this bishop can be changed to the knight on c3, and the knight on f6 can get a very good squares either on e4, either on d5. This happened in the game, so we will see. b3 and rook ac8. Well, I think here that Bernstein was impatient to play rook c2 and passively defend the b2 pawn, but he just thought that after b3, the c4 pawn is very weak, because cba, knight a4 here I think is good to go with this knight with the tempo. Queen b7 and a b3 is just in white's favor, because now the structure changed. There is no more hanging pawns, but instead isolated pawn. You can see series on isolated pawn covered by me, attacking with isolated pawn or weakness of isolated pawn. But this case we have the weakness of isolated pawn, because black has no attacking chances. The knight is on f6, the rook is on d8, and there are no pieces left to attack the king side. So this pawn on d5 is really weakness, and of course it's blocked by the knight on d4. So Capablanca played rook ac8, foreseeing that this pawn on c4 is not a weakness, but instead it's a very strong pawn on the c file. bc4, dc4, and rook c2. So, very logical move. Rook c1, then knight goes somewhere and attacks the pawn on c4. But here, Capablanca saw that it was not as easy as Bernstein dreamt. Bishop c3, rook c3, and knight d5. There is a trick. Rook c4 is not good because of knight c3. And of course, rook c3 is just in black's favor. I mean, black has exchange and a completely winning position. So, knight d5, rook c2, and c3. Pawn advances to c3, rook dc1, and now the great dance of the rook starts. Rook c5, knight b3, rook c6, leading the knight to d4, rook c7, and knight b5. Bernstein hopes that he can take the pawn on c3. Rook c5, and if knight d4, we see that black has tempo, because here it was white's move, and in this position it is black's move. So, of course, Bernstein took on c3, knight c3, rook c3, rook c3, rook c3, and when we think of back rank problems, which game first comes into mind is Bernstein-Capablanca, the famous Queen b2. Now, white has a big problem on the back rank. There is double attack. Here Bernstein resigned, but I will give you the reasons why he resigned, because after Queen b2 there is Rook d1 mate, and Queen e1 is of course not possible. Well, at first sight it protects the c3 rook and the d1 square as well, but exactly these reasons gives the idea of sacrificing the queen to c3, because the queen is overloaded to defend on c3 and d1 at the same time. Queen c3, queen c3, and rook d1, queen e1, rook e1, checkmate. I hope you loved this game and learned a lot of things, and now let's go to see another classical game played by Rubinstein-Nimzowitsch. So, we will quickly go through the opening. e3, knight f6, knight c6, bc6, bishop d3, castle, castle, and bishop d6. Here we have the hanging pawns, and bishop d6 is a very good move, planning c6, c5 advance. Bishop g3. Bishop g5 here is more dubious, because now rook b8, and if queen c2, there is a typical tactic, bishop h2, king h2, and knight g4. Black gets back the piece on g5 and has extra pawn. But it is important here to mention that instead of rook b8, bishop h2 with the same ideas is really wrong, because after king h2, knight g4, there is a counter-attack, queen g4, and white wins the piece and has completely winning position. So rook b8, b3, bishop e5, rook c1, queen d6, we see that black develops with tempo, and on f4, bishop c3, rook c3, rook e8 puts the pressure on e3 pawn with completely fine position for black. So bishop g3 was played in the game, bishop g3, hg3. Now the pawn structure changed a little bit. White has double pawns on g3, and here black advances the c6 pawn to c5. The question is, are the pawns strong or weak? We will see that now. Rook c1, bishop e6, queen a4. As we know, there are very typical provocating moves like e4 to provoke d4 and get c4 square, or if there is de4 exchange, which is at this point very good, knight e4, and after knight e4, bishop e4, we see that the rook is under attack, the pawn is under attack, and on rook c8, defending the c5 pawn, just b3 or queen e2. Black might not have big problems here, but it's slightly better for white. But instead, there is a very good intermediate move, c4. Attacking with tempo and using the fact that after knight f6, queen f6, bishop c4, there is the pawn hanging on b2 with complete equality. So knight e4, c4, and of course if bishop goes, then knight e4, bishop e4, and rook b8. And we see that the c4 pawn is very strong and the rook puts the pressure on b2. So let's get back to the game. Queen a4, queen b6. Now black aims either for dynamic d4 or c4. Queen a3, a very good move, making the a4 square free for knight, and the threat is of course knight a4, putting the pressure on c5, actually winning the c5 pawn. But after c4, black has a bit weak pawn on d5 after c4, but there is such pressure on b2 that it completely compensates it. Bishop e2, a5, a very typical move in this type of positions, the a-pawn advance, and taking the b4 square under control. Rook fd1, queen b4, rook d4. Well, here Nimzowitsch played rook fd8. Queen a3, doubling the pawns, is no threat because after b takes a3, rook b8, bishop f3, and there is a big pressure on d5 pawn. Rook fd8, simple rook cd1. So first rook fd1, rook cd1, rook d7, bishop f3, rook a8. White put as much pressure on d5 pawn as possible, but black defended successfully and there is no progress for white. No way to make progress. So knight b1, rook b8, attacking the b2 pawn, rook 1 d2, and queen a3. The right timing. B takes a3 is not possible because the knight is hanging on b1, and after knight a3, king f8, a very good move. It is important to mention that rook db7 comes under knight c4, and we see that dc4 is not possible because of the problems of back rank. So king f8, e4, de4, rook d7, knight d7, and bishop e4. natural knight c5, and Rubinstein here made a mistake with rook d4. It was better not to leave this bishop to exchange and play bishop c6, but after rook b4, bishop d5, knight a4, black still has a big advantage. After rook d4, knight e4, rook e4, rook b2, knight c4, rook b4, knight d6, changed the rooks, bishop a2, and black easily won this endgame because we see that the bishop is very much stronger than the knight, and there is the passed pawn, the a1. Also the king is near, so we can quickly see how it went. g4, king b4, king d4, pawn advances, and a3, king d3, g6, king c2, and there is no way to stop a2, so Rubinstein here resigned. I hope you loved the examples. See you in part 2.